How did you make an entitled passenger regret choosing your row? The passenger in 14B, Ralph, started complaining before he even sat down on our flight to Denver in May. He looked at me in the middle seat and said I was too big to be sitting there even though I'm average-sized. He said people my size should have to buy 2 seats or sit in a special section. He demanded I move so he could have more room, but the flight was completely full. He told the flight attendant that I was encroaching on his space when I hadn't even unbuckled my seatbelt yet. The flight attendant looked at us and could see I was sitting normally within my seat boundaries. She told Ralph that everyone was seated properly and to please sit down so we could depart. Ralph huffed and dropped into his seat, immediately spreading his legs wide into my space and putting his elbow over the armrest into my area. When I politely asked him to stay in his own space, he said he paid for comfort and I should deal with it. He said if I didn't like it, I could stand for the 4-hour flight. He then pulled out his phone and started playing videos at full volume without headphones. The flight attendant asked him to use headphones and he said he forgot them, so everyone would just have to tolerate it. She said he couldn't play audio without headphones, and he'd need to watch with subtitles or read something. Ralph turned to me and said this was my fault for making him stressed with my presence. He said if I hadn't been so large, he wouldn't need entertainment to distract himself from the discomfort. I'm 5'6" and weigh 140 pounds, but Ralph kept insisting I was taking up too much space. During takeoff, Ralph started eating the smelliest food possible. He'd brought tuna sandwiches, boiled eggs, and some kind of fermented fish his wife had packed. The smell was overwhelming in the confined space. The woman in 14C was actually gagging. When I asked if he could wait until after the flight to eat such strong-smelling food, he said I was probably just jealous because I clearly ate everything in sight. He said maybe the smell would motivate me to diet. The flight attendant had to come over again when Ralph started kicking the seat in front of him because the person reclined slightly. He said reclining seats should be banned and anyone who used them was selfish. The passenger in front turned around and asked him to stop kicking. Ralph said he'd stop when the seat went back up. The flight attendant told Ralph that passengers had the right to recline, and he needed to stop kicking immediately, or there would be consequences. Ralph waited until she left and started kicking again, but lighter, so it was just constant annoying taps. That's when I decided Ralph needed to experience his own medicine. I started by accidentally spilling my water on his tray table when we hit the tiniest bit of turbulence. The water ran right onto his laptop keyboard and his documents. Ralph jumped up screaming about his destroyed work. I apologized profusely and said the turbulence caught me off guard. I offered him napkins but made sure to knock over his coffee in the process of reaching for them. Now his pants were soaked with hot coffee and his laptop was definitely damaged. Ralph called for the flight attendant demanding I be arrested for destruction of property. She asked what happened and I explained about the turbulence. Several passengers confirmed we'd hit a bump and that accidents happen. Ralph had to sit in wet pants for the remaining 3 hours. Next, I started doing everything Ralph had done but worse. I spread my legs wide, taking up all the space under his seat where he'd put his bag. When he complained, I said I paid for comfort too. I pulled out my phone and started watching cooking shows at medium volume, just low enough that the flight attendant wouldn't say anything but loud enough to be annoying. When Ralph complained, I said I forgot my headphones just like he did. Then I opened my lunch, which my friend had packed specially for this trip. She worked at a specialty cheese shop and had given me the strongest, smelliest cheeses available. I'm talking about cheese that smelled like feet mixed with garbage. I also had kimchi, dried squid, and century eggs. The combination of smells was so intense that people 3 rows away were complaining. Ralph was turning green and had to use his air sickness bag. When he begged me to put the food away, I said he was probably just jealous of my gourmet meal. I ate everything slowly, making sure to chew with my mouth slightly open so he could hear every bite. The woman in 14C was laughing quietly because she'd heard everything Ralph had said to me earlier. She even offered me some of her garlic spread to make the smell worse. For the rest of the flight, I made sure Ralph was miserable. I accidentally elbowed him every time I adjusted my position. I sneezed without covering my mouth in his direction, though I didn't actually spray anything. I drummed my fingers on the armrest constantly. I stood up to use the bathroom 8 times, making him get up each time. When he refused the 5th time, I said loudly that I had a medical condition, and was he really going to make me have an accident? Everyone turned to stare at him with disgust, and he had to move. The best part came during landing. Ralph grabbed the air sickness bag again as another wave of kimchi smell hit him. I watched his face turn an even worse shade of green while he pressed the bag to his mouth. The flight attendant walked down the aisle toward us with the captain right behind her. They stopped at our row, and the captain leaned down to speak quietly to Ralph. He told Ralph that if he couldn't compose himself for landing, they would need to make other arrangements. Ralph went completely silent and pressed himself against the window. His face was still green, but now he looked scared too. The captain straightened up and walked back toward the front of the plane. I could feel Ralph shaking slightly in the seat next to me. The woman in 14C caught my eye and gave me a small smile. I turned to her and mentioned casually that I hoped the landing would go smoothly, since I tended to get motion sick during descent. She grinned at me and said she understood completely. Ralph shot us both a desperate look but didn't say anything. The captain was still watching our row from 2 rows up. Ralph's mouth opened like he wanted to complain, but then he closed it again. His hands gripped the armrests so hard his knuckles turned white. The plane started its descent, and I felt the pressure change in my ears. I shifted in my seat to get more comfortable, and my shoulder bumped into Ralph's. He pressed himself harder against the cold airplane wall. I adjusted my position again and bumped him once more. Ralph was trapped between the window and me with nowhere to go. Every time I moved, he had to press against the wall to avoid touching me. I could see him trying not to gag as the smell from my lunch lingered in the air. The turbulence made me shift around even more. Ralph looked like he wanted to cry. The flight attendant's voice came over the speaker, announcing we were beginning final approach. She said everyone needed to return their seats to the upright position. The passenger in front of Ralph pushed his seat forward. Ralph actually looked relieved for about half a second. Then I stretched my legs out and accidentally kicked his bag further under his feet. The bag wedged itself between his ankles and the seat in front. Ralph tried to pull it out, but there wasn't enough room. He had to sit with his feet in an awkward position for the rest of the descent. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures of the view out the window. Each time I raised my phone, my elbow extended fully into Ralph's space. He tried to lean away, but the window blocked him. The woman in 14C was covering her mouth with her hand. I could tell she was trying not to laugh out loud. I took about 15 pictures, making sure to really stretch my arm out for each one. Ralph's face showed pure misery mixed with the green color from his nausea. He raised his hand to try to get the flight attendant's attention. She was walking through the cabin doing final checks and completely ignored his raised hand. She walked right past our row without even glancing at him. Ralph's arm dropped back down. His face showed total frustration as he realized nobody was going to help him. We only had about 20 minutes left until landing. The turbulence got rougher as we dropped through the clouds. The plane bounced and shook more than usual. I made a big show of looking scared and grabbed for the armrest. My hand landed right on top of Ralph's hand. He jerked his hand away so fast that he banged his elbow hard on the window frame. I heard him gasp in pain. He rubbed his elbow while glaring at me. I said loudly that I was so sorry about the armrest incident. I explained that the turbulence had scared me, and I just grabbed whatever was closest. Several passengers sitting nearby nodded their heads in understanding. One man said the turbulence was pretty bad. Ralph glared at me with pure hatred in his eyes. He couldn't complain now without looking petty after everything he had done during the flight. Everyone around us had seen his behavior. If he complained about me grabbing the armrest during turbulence, he would just look worse. The plane dropped altitude again and my ears popped. I yawned really wide with my mouth open as far as it would go. Ralph got a full view, and probably a reminder of all the smelly food I had just eaten. His face went from green to almost gray. He grabbed the air sickness bag again and had to use it. Other passengers nearby looked at him with disgust. A woman across the aisle wrinkled her nose and looked away. Ralph wiped his mouth with a napkin and slumped in his seat. The woman in 14C leaned over toward me. She asked if I was okay in a voice loud enough for others around us to hear clearly. Her face showed concern for my well-being. I thanked her and said I was fine, just a little motion sick from the descent. She patted my arm sympathetically. Ralph watched this exchange, and I could see the realization spreading across his face. Everyone around us saw me as the victim and him as the problem passenger. His face turned red with shame on top of the green from being sick. The combination of colors made him look absolutely terrible. He sank lower in his seat and stared straight ahead. His wet, coffee-stained pants stuck to the seat. His damaged laptop sat useless in his bag under his feet. The smell from my lunch still hung in the air around our row. I started humming under my breath as the plane dropped through the clouds. The tune had no melody, just random notes that came out wrong on purpose. Ralph shifted in his seat next to me. The sound was just quiet enough that the flight attendant walking past didn't notice, but loud enough that Ralph heard every off-key note. He turned his head toward me with his mouth opening like he wanted to say something. Then he closed it again. He couldn't complain about humming after he'd played his videos at full volume for everyone to hear. His jaw muscles tensed as I kept going, mixing in some random whistling between hums. The woman in 14C glanced over and smiled slightly when she saw what I was doing. Ralph suddenly spread his legs wide as we continued descending. His knee pushed into the space under my seat. I felt his leg pressing against mine, trying to claim territory one last time. I spread my legs wider immediately and planted both feet flat on the floor. My position was solid and unmovable. Ralph tried to push back, but I had better leverage from the middle seat. He had to pull his legs back together, his knees pressed against each other in an uncomfortable position. The same position he'd tried to force me into for the entire flight. His face went red as he realized he'd lost this final battle for space. He stared straight ahead at the seat back in front of him. The pilot's voice came over the speaker announcing 5 minutes until landing. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a piece of gum. I unwrapped it slowly, making sure the crinkling sound carried. I popped the gum in my mouth and started chewing with my lips slightly apart. The smacking sound was soft but steady. Ralph's hands gripped the armrests. I could see his jaw clenching with each smack of my gum. His knuckles went white from squeezing so hard, but he said nothing. He just sat there taking it, knowing that everyone around us had seen his behavior. Complaining about gum chewing would make him look even more ridiculous. I chewed a little louder. The plane's wheels hit the runway with a bump. I let out a huge sigh and stretched my arms up and out like I was celebrating. My right elbow connected with Ralph's head. Not hard enough to really hurt, but enough that he felt it. He jerked back and grabbed his head with one hand. I turned to him right away with a concerned look. I said I was so sorry. The landing startled me and I stretched without thinking. My voice sounded perfectly sincere. Ralph rubbed the spot where my elbow hit while glaring at me with pure hate in his eyes. But we were surrounded by witnesses. Other passengers were gathering their things and standing up. He couldn't make a scene now without looking crazy. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The plane slowed down and turned toward the gate. The seatbelt sign dinged off. I unbuckled immediately and jumped to my feet. Ralph was trapped in the window seat. I took my sweet time reaching up to the overhead bin. I stretched up slowly and fumbled with the latch. Ralph sat below me in his coffee-stained pants. The brown stains had dried into the fabric. His laptop bag sat at his feet, holding his ruined computer. He looked absolutely miserable sitting there while I blocked his exit. Other passengers in the aisle were moving forward. Ralph would have to wait until I finished getting my bag down. I smiled to myself as I finally grabbed my bag. My jacket slipped out of my hands as I pulled the bag down. It fell right onto Ralph's head and draped over his face. The sleeve landed on his laptop bag. Ralph grabbed the jacket and threw it off with both hands. His face was bright red now. Several passengers nearby turned to look at the commotion. A man behind us made a comment about people who can't control their stuff. His voice was loud enough for everyone in our section to hear. Ralph's face got even redder. He sank lower in his seat like he wanted to disappear. I picked up my jacket slowly and said sorry again. My tone suggested this was just another accident in a series of unfortunate events. The woman in 14C stood up and turned toward me. She spoke loudly enough that people 3 rows up could hear her clearly. She thanked me for being such a pleasant seatmate during such a difficult flight. Her emphasis on the word pleasant was obvious. She smiled at me warmly while completely ignoring Ralph. Several passengers nearby nodded their heads. They'd all witnessed Ralph's behavior throughout the flight. Ralph's face went from red to almost purple. He realized she was deliberately contrasting me with him, making it clear to everyone who the problem passenger had been. His hands gripped his knees and he stared down at the floor. The woman winked at me as she grabbed her bag. I stepped into the aisle with my bag over my shoulder. I turned back to Ralph one more time. I told him I really hoped his laptop would be okay, and that his day got better from here. My voice was perfectly sincere and concerned, like I genuinely cared about his well-being after everything that happened. But we both knew exactly what I was doing, rubbing salt in every wound, reminding him of his ruined laptop and terrible flight. His glare was so intense it could have melted steel. His jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack, but he still said nothing. What could he say? Everyone around us knew he'd brought this all on himself. I walked up the aisle slowly. The woman from 14C walked beside me. We started talking about how some people just make flights harder than they need to be. Our voices carried back toward row 14. Several passengers who'd witnessed Ralph's behavior throughout the flight nodded as we passed. One man gave me a thumbs up. A woman smiled and shook her head. I could feel Ralph seething behind us. He was stuck in his row waiting for it to clear, sitting in his wet pants, holding his damaged laptop, knowing that everyone saw him as the villain of this flight. The woman from 14C laughed quietly as we reached the front of the plane. The flight attendant stood near the exit door. She smiled when she saw me approaching. She thanked me for my patience during the flight. Then she shot a very meaningful look back toward row 14. Her expression said everything without words. I thanked her for her professionalism and for handling such a difficult situation. We shared a moment of complete understanding. Both of us knew exactly who had caused all the problems. She touched my arm briefly and told me to have a great day in Denver. I walked into the jetway feeling better than I had in months. Ralph would remember this flight for a very long time. The woman from 14C caught up with me in the jetway and stuck out her hand. She said her name was Kellen, and she'd been flying for 20 years, but never saw anyone handle a jerk that perfectly. I shook her hand and thanked her for the garlic spread assist. She laughed and pulled out a business card from her purse. She told me if I ever needed a reference for staying calm under pressure, she'd be happy to write one. I took the card and saw she worked in human resources for a tech company. We kept walking together through the jetway while she told me about other terrible passengers she'd witnessed over the years. None of them got the comeuppance Ralph just experienced. We reached the gate area, and I spotted Ralph coming out of the jetway behind us. He still looked wet and miserable, clutching his damaged laptop against his chest like it might fall apart. His shirt had coffee stains down the front, and his pants were still damp. He saw me standing with Kellen and several other passengers from our section who'd stopped to chat. His face went red and then pale as he realized everyone was talking about him. The guy from row 13 was laughing and pointing in Ralph's direction. The woman who'd been sitting across the aisle was shaking her head. Ralph knew he'd been completely defeated socially, and everyone saw him as the villain. He tried to walk past quickly, but someone from row 15 called out, asking if his laptop survived the turbulence. Ralph didn't answer, and walked faster toward the signs pointing to baggage claim. The passenger Ralph had been kicking walked up to me with a huge grin on his face. He said he wanted to thank me for the entertainment because he'd been about to lose his temper completely. Watching my revenge unfold was way more satisfying than anything he could have done. He said Ralph deserved every second of misery, and the coffee-soaked pants were perfect justice. Ralph was about 20 feet away, and definitely heard this because his shoulders tensed up and he started walking even faster. He practically jogged toward the escalators leading down to baggage claim. Several people from our flight noticed him rushing away, and a few laughed. Kellen said something about karma working in mysterious ways, and the guy who'd been kicked agreed enthusiastically. I felt genuinely good about standing up for myself without losing my cool or getting in actual trouble. The whole situation played out better than I could have planned. Ralph faced natural consequences for his behavior, and everyone witnessed it. I didn't have to yell or make a scene or get the flight attendants involved beyond the initial interactions. His own actions came back to hit him, and I just helped them along a little bit. I headed toward baggage claim with Kellen still walking beside me. We talked about her job and my work and how we both traveled fairly often. The escalator took us down to the lower level where the baggage carousels were spinning. I spotted Ralph immediately because he was on his phone and gesturing wildly. His face was red again and he kept pointing at his laptop. He was probably talking to his wife about the ruined computer and his destroyed clothes. Other passengers from our flight gave him plenty of space as they walked past. Nobody wanted anything to do with him after watching his behavior for 4 hours. A few people glanced at him and then looked away quickly. One woman actually changed direction to avoid walking near him. Ralph didn't notice because he was too busy arguing on the phone. His voice got louder and I heard him say something about suing someone. I wondered if he meant me or the airline or just the universe in general for his terrible day. Our baggage carousel started moving, and bags began sliding down the chute. Mine came out in the first group because I'd checked in early. I grabbed it and noticed Ralph was still on the phone, getting more upset by the second. His bag hadn't appeared yet, and the carousel kept spinning with other people's luggage. I allowed myself a small smile thinking about how his bad day kept getting worse through no extra effort from me. The universe was handling the rest of the punishment. His laptop was ruined, his clothes were stained and wet, his bag was delayed, and everyone from the flight thought he was a jerk. Sometimes karma doesn't need much help, just a little push in the right direction with some strategic cheese and well-timed turbulence. I started walking toward the exit signs for ground transportation. Kellen caught up with me near the automatic doors. She pulled out her phone and showed me a post she'd just made on social media. It was vague enough that nobody could identify Ralph or me or even the specific flight. But she'd written about witnessing perfect petty revenge and how sometimes entitled people get exactly what they deserve. Her friends were already commenting and calling the mystery person a hero. I laughed and told her that was amazing. She said the story was too good not to share even in a general way. We exchanged actual phone numbers and email addresses instead of just business cards. She said if we were ever in the same city, we should definitely get coffee. It was funny how Ralph's terrible behavior led to me making a new friend who shared my sense of justice. If he'd just been a normal, decent person, I never would have talked to Kellen beyond basic pleasantries. Outside the airport, the Colorado air hit me and I took a deep breath. My rideshare app showed my driver was 3 minutes away. I stood near the pickup area and finally relaxed for the first time since boarding that plane. The whole situation could have gone very differently if I'd just accepted Ralph's bullying. I could have sat there miserable for 4 hours while he spread into my space and insulted me and made the flight unbearable. Instead, I stood up for myself using his own tactics against him. It felt like an important moment of self-respect, even though the methods were petty. Sometimes you have to fight fire with fire, or in this case, fight smelly food with smellier food and fake accidents with real consequences. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a text from my friend asking how the flight went. She was the one who'd packed the specialty cheeses and knew I was sitting in a middle seat. I realized I had an amazing story to tell her. I started typing out the whole thing right there on the sidewalk. My thumbs flew across the screen as I described Ralph's initial complaints and his aggressive behavior and the flight attendant's interventions. Then I got to the good part about the water spill and the coffee disaster and the cheese deployment. I was grinning while I typed because I knew this would become one of my favorite stories about travel karma. The kind of story you tell at parties and people always want to hear again. My friend would absolutely love it since her cheese expertise contributed directly to Ralph's misery. My rideshare showed up right on schedule and I climbed into the back seat. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror and asked how my flight was. I couldn't help laughing out loud. I told him it was definitely one I'd remember for a while. He seemed curious, so I gave him the short version about Ralph complaining I was too big for the middle seat even though I'm average-sized, then spreading into my space and playing videos without headphones and eating the smelliest food possible. I explained how I accidentally spilled water and coffee all over his laptop during turbulence, then pulled out even smellier food that made him sick for the rest of the flight. The driver started cracking up and said he wished more people would stand up to jerks like that. He said too many folks just take abuse on planes because they don't want to cause problems. I agreed and said I almost did the same thing until Ralph pushed me too far. The driver told me about a time someone reclined their seat all the way back into his lap on a red-eye flight, and he didn't say anything for 6 hours. He said he regretted not speaking up, and my story made him feel better about future situations. We chatted the whole ride home about airplane etiquette and entitled passengers. He dropped me off at my apartment building and said the ride was free because my story made his day. I tried to insist on paying, but he refused and drove off laughing. I walked into my apartment and immediately pulled out my phone to call my best friend. She picked up on the second ring, and I launched into the full detailed version of everything that happened with Ralph. I started from the moment he looked at me with disgust, before even sitting down, and went through every single thing he did and said. She was dying laughing when I got to the part about the water spill during turbulence and the coffee following right after. When I described opening the specialty cheeses and watching Ralph turn green, she had to put the phone down because she couldn't breathe from laughing so hard. I told her about the woman in 14C offering me garlic spread and Ralph using the air sickness bag multiple times. I explained how I made him get up 8 times for bathroom trips and how everyone stared at him with disgust when I mentioned my medical condition. My friend said this was the best revenge story she'd ever heard, and I absolutely had to write it down. She suggested posting it online somewhere because other people would love it, and it was too good to keep to myself. I told her I'd think about it, but she insisted, saying stories like this needed to be shared, so people would know they don't have to just accept terrible behavior from entitled passengers. That evening, I sat down at my laptop and started typing out the whole experience from beginning to end. I joined a forum where people shared stories about dealing with difficult people and found the section about travel nightmares. I wrote everything exactly as it happened, keeping all the facts straight but making sure to include the satisfying details about Ralph getting exactly what he deserved. I described his initial complaints about my size even though I'm 5'6" and 140 pounds. I included his aggressive behavior with spreading into my space and refusing to use headphones and eating fermented fish. I made sure to mention how the flight attendant had to intervene multiple times because of his actions. Then I got to the good part about my accidental water spill and the coffee disaster that followed. I described the specialty cheeses in detail and how the smell made people 3 rows away complain. I included the part about making Ralph get up 8 times in his face when I mentioned my medical condition loudly. I wrote about the woman in 14C supporting me and offering garlic spread. I ended with how Ralph looked completely defeated by the time we landed, sitting in his wet coffee-stained pants with his ruined laptop. I read through it twice to make sure everything was accurate, and then hit the post button. Within an hour, my post started getting responses. People were commenting that they'd dealt with similar situations on flights and wished they'd handled it as well as I did. Someone wrote about a passenger who took off their shoes and put their bare feet on the armrest, and how they just suffered through it instead of doing anything. Another person shared a story about someone clipping their toenails mid-flight and how disgusting it was. Multiple people said my approach was perfect because I used Ralph's own tactics against him and never actually broke any rules. They pointed out that the turbulence and accidents weren't my fault, and eating smelly food was exactly what Ralph had done first. Several commenters said they were saving my post to remember the techniques if they ever encountered someone like Ralph. One person wrote that entitled behavior on planes had gotten so much worse in recent years, and more people needed to push back. I realized this kind of thing wasn't rare at all. Tons of travelers had experienced passengers who spread into their space or played loud videos or ate terrible-smelling food or kicked seats. The difference was most people just accepted it and stayed miserable for the whole flight. Reading all these responses made me glad I'd stood up for myself instead of just taking Ralph's abuse for 4 hours. Over the next few days, my post kept getting more and more responses. By the third day, there were hundreds of comments and the number kept climbing. People were sharing their own airplane revenge stories, and some of them were even better than mine. Someone wrote about a passenger who kept pushing the call button every 5 minutes for no reason, so they accidentally spilled ice water down the person's back during turbulence. Another person described dealing with someone who wouldn't stop talking by pretending to fall asleep and snoring really loudly every time the person tried to start a conversation. Multiple people said my story inspired them to stand up for themselves in similar situations instead of just accepting bad behavior. One woman wrote that she'd always been too scared to say anything when passengers were rude, but after reading my post, she felt empowered to set boundaries on her next flight. A man commented that he used my cheese technique on a recent trip when someone spread into his seat and it worked perfectly. Several people thanked me for sharing because it made them realize they had options when dealing with entitled jerks. It felt really good knowing my experience with Ralph might actually help other people feel confident enough to push back against bullies instead of suffering in silence. A week later, I got a private message through the forum from someone who said they were on my flight and recognized the story immediately. They confirmed every single detail I'd written was accurate and said they'd been sitting a few rows behind me. The person added that after we landed, Ralph went straight to the gate agents and tried to get me in trouble. He'd apparently complained that I deliberately destroyed his laptop and clothes and demanded the airline compensate him or have me arrested. The gate agents asked what happened, and Ralph told them about the water and coffee spills. They asked if there had been turbulence, and Ralph admitted there was a small bump, but insisted I did it on purpose. The agents told him there was nothing they could do about accidents during turbulence, and that he'd need to file a claim with his insurance company. Ralph got really angry and demanded to speak to a supervisor. The supervisor came out and listened to his complaint and gave him the same answer. The person messaging me said they watched the whole thing, and Ralph was turning red and yelling while the gate agent stayed completely calm and professional. Eventually, Ralph gave up and stormed off toward baggage claim, still wet and miserable. The same person sent another message a few minutes later with even better news. They said they'd overheard Ralph on his phone at baggage claim talking to someone about his ruined laptop. Apparently, it was completely destroyed by the water and coffee and wouldn't turn on at all. He'd lost whatever work was on it because he hadn't backed anything up to the cloud. The person also said Ralph missed his connecting flight because he had to spend so much time trying to get cleaned up in the airport bathroom and filing his pointless complaint with the gate agents. His next flight wasn't until the following morning, so he had to pay for an unexpected hotel room. Ralph had apparently tried to get the airline to cover the hotel cost since his missed connection was due to another passenger's actions, but they refused because the original flight arrived on time and his delay was his own fault. I felt absolutely zero guilt about any of this. Ralph brought every single bit of it on himself by being aggressive and entitled and making my flight miserable from the start. If he'd just been a normal, decent person and stayed in his own space, none of this would have happened to him. My friend who packed the specialty cheeses sent me a text asking how everything worked out with her contributions. I texted back that the cheeses were absolutely perfect and performed exactly as needed. I told her Ralph turned green and had to use the air sickness bag multiple times, and people 3 rows away were complaining about the smell. She responded that she was glad her cheese expertise contributed to justice being served. She said the ones she gave me were some of the strongest in the shop, and she'd specifically chosen them for maximum impact. She offered to prepare another care package anytime I needed to deal with difficult people, whether on planes or anywhere else. I thanked her and said I'd definitely keep that in mind for future situations. She sent back a laughing emoji and said she considered it her civic duty to help people stand up to bullies using the power of fermented dairy products. I went online and booked another flight for next month to visit family. I was looking at the seat selection screen and realized I wasn't anxious about it at all, even though the only available seat was in the middle again. Before the Ralph experience, I would have been worried about who I'd end up sitting next to and whether they'd be rude or spread into my space. Now I felt completely confident that I could handle whatever situation came up. The Ralph experience taught me that I don't have to just accept bad behavior from other passengers. I have tools and techniques to push back if someone tries to make my flight miserable. I'm not looking for conflict, and I hope my next flight is completely boring with polite, considerate seatmates. But if I do encounter another entitled jerk like Ralph, I know exactly what to do. and I won't hesitate to stand up for myself. At work the next day, I was eating lunch in the break room with a few coworkers. Someone asked about my trip and I started telling the Ralph story. Within 2 minutes, everyone at the table had stopped eating and was listening with complete attention. When I got to the part about the coffee spill following the water spill, people started laughing. By the time I described opening the specialty cheeses, everyone was cracking up. I went through the whole thing, including making Ralph get up 8 times and the woman in 14C offering garlic spread. My coworkers were amazed, and several of them said they would have just suffered in silence for the whole flight. One person said she never would have thought to mirror the bad behavior back at someone. Another coworker admitted he'd dealt with a similar situation last year and just sat there miserable because he didn't want to cause problems. My boss was walking by and overheard the end of the story. He stopped and asked me to start over from the beginning. I went through it again, and he listened to the whole thing. When I finished, he said that standing up for yourself professionally is an important skill even in personal situations. He said too many people think being professional means accepting bad treatment, but really it means setting boundaries while staying calm and strategic. He told the whole table that my approach was perfect because I never lost my temper or broke any rules. I just used Ralph's own tactics against him in a way he couldn't complain about. Everyone nodded and agreed, and for the rest of lunch, people kept bringing up different parts of the story and laughing about Ralph's miserable flight. That evening, my phone lit up with a text from Kellen. She said she'd told the Ralph story at a dinner party with her work friends, and everyone agreed I'd handled the situation perfectly. Her message made me smile because she wrote that we should definitely meet up for coffee soon, since she enjoyed my company and sense of humor. I texted back that I'd love to grab coffee whenever she was in town again, and we made loose plans to coordinate schedules in the future. It felt good knowing that the whole airplane situation had led to making a genuine new friend who shared my views on standing up to entitled behavior. A month went by and I found myself on another flight, this time headed to Portland for a work conference. I'd booked a middle seat again because it was the only option available, but I wasn't worried about it at all. When I got to my row, the guy in the window seat smiled and said hello, then went back to his book. The woman in the aisle seat helped me put my bag in the overhead bin and asked if I wanted her to move so I could get settled. Both of them stayed completely in their own space during the entire flight. Nobody played videos without headphones, nobody ate smelly food, nobody kicked seats or spread their legs into my area. The flight was totally boring and uneventful, and I realized how much I appreciated normal, considerate people after dealing with Ralph. Sometimes the best flights are the ones where absolutely nothing interesting happens and everyone just respects each other's space. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing entitled behavior in other situations more clearly. At the grocery store, someone cut in front of me in line, and I calmly said I was already waiting there. The person apologized and moved to the back. At a restaurant, someone at the next table was playing music on their phone, and I politely asked them to use headphones. They did without arguing. The Ralph experience had given me confidence to set boundaries without being aggressive or losing my temper. I wasn't looking for conflicts, but I also wasn't going to let people walk all over me anymore. I could stand my ground firmly but calmly, and most people responded well when I addressed issues directly, instead of just accepting bad behavior in silence. 3 months after the flight, I went to a party at my friend's house. Someone asked me about travel horror stories, and I launched into the Ralph saga. About halfway through, a guy I didn't know interrupted and said he'd heard a similar story online recently. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling through some forum posts, then looked up at me with wide eyes and asked if the story was about me. I confirmed it was my actual experience, and suddenly I had 8 people gathered around wanting to hear the full version with all the details. I went through the entire thing again, starting with Ralph's complaints before he even sat down, and ending with him leaving the plane soaking wet and miserable. Everyone was cracking up at the specialty cheese deployment and the perfectly timed coffee spill. Several people said they wished they'd been there to see Ralph's face when the smell hit him. The Ralph story became my go-to tale at social gatherings over the next few months. I'd refined it to hit all the best moments and knew exactly when to pause for maximum effect. People always laughed hardest at the part where the woman in 14C offered me her garlic spread to make the smell even worse. They loved hearing about Ralph turning green and using the air sickness bag. Several friends asked me to teach them my techniques for handling difficult people, wanting to know how I stayed calm while executing such perfect petty revenge. I explained that the key was never losing your temper and always having plausible deniability for everything. The turbulence really did cause the water spill, and I really did forget my headphones just like Ralph did. Everything I did to him was just mirroring his own behavior back at him. Kellen messaged me in early fall saying she was coming to my city for a work conference. We finally met up for coffee at a place near her hotel. As soon as we sat down, we started laughing about the flight all over again. She said she still thought about it whenever she flew and hoped to witness something that entertaining again, though she admitted she was glad most flights were boring. We talked for almost 2 hours, sharing other travel stories and finding out we had a lot in common beyond our shared Ralph experience. She told me she'd made the story slightly anonymous when posting about it online, but her friends still figured out it was her based on the details. We exchanged promises to stay in touch and agreed that sometimes the worst experiences lead to the best stories and unexpected friendships. 6 months after the Ralph incident, I was completely over any stress from the situation. It had transformed into just a great story that I enjoyed telling. I'd learned that standing up for yourself doesn't have to mean losing your temper or getting aggressive. Sometimes strategic pettiness is the perfect response when someone refuses to respect basic boundaries. Ralph had created a hostile environment from the moment he sat down, and instead of just suffering through it, I'd made him experience his own medicine. The whole thing taught me that you don't have to accept mistreatment just to avoid conflict. There are ways to push back that stay within the rules while still making your point crystal clear. A few weeks later, I got upgraded to first class on a flight to Chicago. When I checked in at the gate, I joked with the agent that I promised not to bring any smelly cheese on board. She looked confused for a second, then laughed when I gave her a very brief explanation about my previous flight adventure. She said the flight would definitely be more peaceful than my last experience, and that first-class passengers were usually pretty well behaved. I settled into my spacious seat with plenty of legroom and nobody encroaching on my space, thinking about how different this was from being crammed in the middle seat next to Ralph. The flight was smooth and quiet, and I actually got some work done without any drama or conflict. In October, I was scrolling through news articles during lunch when I came across a piece about airplane etiquette and passenger rights. The writer was discussing creative conflict resolution and included several examples of passengers handling difficult situations. One of the stories sounded really familiar, and then I realized it was my Ralph experience. The article quoted my post anonymously, but used it as an example of how passengers can stand up for themselves without escalating to violence or getting removed from flights. The writer praised the approach of mirroring bad behavior back at the person causing problems, noting that it was more effective than complaining to flight attendants or suffering in silence. It was cool to see my experience contributing to a larger conversation about how to deal with entitled people in confined spaces. After reading that article, I started a new tradition of packing interesting snacks on every flight. Nothing as extreme as the cheese arsenal I'd deployed against Ralph, but enough variety to remind me that I had options if someone decided to be unreasonable. I'd bring some kimchi chips, dried mango, and maybe some garlic crackers. Just knowing I could deploy them if needed made me feel more confident walking onto planes. I never actually had to use them because I never encountered another passenger as terrible as Ralph, but having that backup plan gave me peace of mind. It was like carrying insurance against entitled behavior, a reminder that I wasn't helpless if someone tried to make my flight miserable again. A few weeks after the flight, my friend Sarah called me during her lunch break sounding completely stressed out. She worked in marketing at a tech company and had this coworker named Brad who kept taking credit for her ideas in meetings and interrupting her presentations. She asked if I had any advice because she'd heard about my airplane situation and figured I might know how to handle difficult people without getting fired. I thought about Ralph and how mirroring his behavior back at him had been way more effective than just complaining or staying quiet. I told Sarah to start documenting everything Brad did with dates and times, and then to use his own tactics against him in subtle ways. Next time he interrupted her, she should acknowledge his point and then redirect back to her original idea while making it clear she'd already covered that topic. If he tried to take credit, she should forward emails to her boss showing her original work with timestamps. She needed to stay professional, but make it impossible for him to keep stealing her contributions without looking obvious. Sarah tried my approach over the next 2 weeks and called me back to say it worked perfectly. Brad interrupted her once in a meeting, and she calmly said she appreciated his enthusiasm, but she was still presenting and would take questions at the end. The whole room went quiet, and Brad looked embarrassed. Then she started CCing her boss on all project emails, so there was a clear record of her work, and Brad couldn't claim ideas anymore without contradicting the email trail. Her boss even pulled her aside to say he'd noticed her taking more initiative lately, which meant he was finally seeing her actual contributions instead of Brad's theft. Sarah thanked me for the confidence boost and said thinking about the Ralph situation reminded her that she didn't have to just accept bad treatment. I was scrolling through news articles one morning in July when I saw a headline about airlines implementing stricter policies for unruly passengers. The article talked about increased fines, potential flight bans, and better support for crew members dealing with difficult people. I immediately thought about Ralph and wondered if he'd learned anything from our flight, or if he was still out there making everyone miserable at 30,000 feet. Knowing his personality and how he blamed me for everything even when he was clearly the problem, I figured he probably told the story completely differently to anyone who would listen. In his version, he was probably the victim of an oversized passenger who deliberately destroyed his laptop and made the flight unbearable with disgusting food. He'd leave out the parts about spreading into my space, playing videos without headphones, eating smelly food first, and kicking the seat in front of him. People like Ralph never think they're the problem. They always find someone else to blame for the consequences of their own behavior. I hoped the new airline policies would at least make it harder for him to get away with treating people badly, but I wasn't holding my breath. Some people go through their whole lives being entitled jerks and never figure out that they're the common factor in all their conflicts. My family had a big gathering at my aunt's house in August for my cousin's birthday, and somehow the airplane story came up during dinner. My cousin Kendall said she'd heard about it from my mom, but wanted me to tell the real version because the secondhand account didn't have all the details. I launched into the full story, starting with Ralph's comments about my size before we even took off, his constant invasions of my space, the smelly food he ate, while insulting me, and then my strategic revenge with the water spill, coffee incident, and the cheese arsenal that made him sick. Everyone at the table was laughing by the time I got to the part about making him get up 8 times for bathroom trips, and my uncle actually had tears running down his face when I described Ralph turning green from the specialty cheese smell. My uncle said he wished he'd been there to see Ralph's face when I pulled out the kimchi and dried squid, and my aunt said I should have taken pictures for evidence. My teenage nephew asked if I got in any trouble, and seemed impressed when I explained how I'd stayed within the rules by using accidents and medical excuses. Kendall said the story was even better than she'd imagined, and asked if I'd ever seen Ralph again. I told her no, and I hoped I never would, but if I did run into him on another flight, I'd be fully prepared with an even worse selection of smelly foods. The whole table agreed that Ralph got exactly what he deserved, and that more people should stand up to entitled jerks, instead of just tolerating their behavior. Over the next few months, I noticed the Ralph story had become one of those defining experiences that people associated with me. Whenever someone at work or in my friend group talked about dealing with difficult people, someone would inevitably say I should tell them about the airplane incident. It was kind of funny how a 4-hour flight had turned into such a memorable experience that I'd probably be telling this story for years. The situation taught me that you don't have to be aggressive or lose your temper to stand up for yourself. Sometimes the best response is strategic pettiness that mirrors the bad behavior back at the person causing problems. I'd gone from being someone who usually avoided conflict to someone who knew how to handle entitled people without escalating to the point where I'd get in trouble. The story had also given me a reputation as someone who didn't take crap from anyone, which honestly felt pretty good. Friends started asking me for advice when they dealt with difficult coworkers, rude customers, or pushy family members, and I could give them concrete examples of how to set boundaries while staying calm. The Ralph experience had become part of my personal mythology, in a way I never expected. I started planning a trip for next year to visit my brother in Seattle, and this time I specifically chose a window seat when booking my ticket. After my middle seat adventure with Ralph, I decided I'd earned the upgrade, and the extra cost was totally worth it for guaranteed personal space and control over my environment. Window seats meant nobody could encroach on my space from that side. I could control the window shade, and I only had to deal with one seatmate instead of 2. I wouldn't have to ask anyone to move if I needed the bathroom, and I could lean against the wall if I wanted to sleep without worrying about falling onto a stranger's shoulder. The middle seat experience had taught me that the cheapest option isn't always the best choice, especially when it comes to being trapped in a confined space for hours with potentially terrible people. I figured the extra $40 for the window seat was like buying insurance against another Ralph situation, and my mental health was definitely worth that investment. Plus, I'd have a better view during takeoff and landing, which was a nice bonus on top of the practical benefits. A coworker named Jennifer mentioned during a coffee break that she had a flight coming up for a family wedding, and she was nervous about getting stuck next to a difficult seatmate. She'd heard about my Ralph experience and asked if I had any tips for handling the situation if it happened to her. I told her the most important thing was to stay calm and not let someone's bad behavior make you lose your composure, because then you become the problem in everyone's eyes. I explained that she should document everything if someone was being unreasonable, like taking photos of them spreading into her space or recording video of them playing loud videos without headphones. Flight attendants are more likely to help if you have evidence and you present it calmly instead of getting emotional. I also told her about the strategy of mirroring bad behavior back at the person, but doing it in ways that seem accidental or justified so you can't get in trouble. If someone spreads into your space, you spread back. If they're loud, you can be loud too within the rules. The key is using their own tactics against them while maintaining plausible deniability. Jennifer wrote down my advice and said she felt way more confident about her flight now, knowing she had options if someone tried to make her trip miserable. I got a message through my social media in September from someone who'd read my post about the Ralph situation. They said they'd used my techniques on their own flight just last week with great success. This guy named Andrew had been sitting next to a woman who kept elbowing him and taking up both armrests while complaining that he was too tall and should have bought a first-class seat. He remembered my story and started mirroring her behavior, spreading out whenever she did and making sure to reclaim the armrest every time she tried to dominate it. When she complained to the flight attendant, he calmly explained that he was just matching her energy and staying within his seat boundaries. The flight attendant could see what was happening and told the woman she needed to stay in her own space, which made Andrew's whole flight better. He thanked me for sharing my story and said it gave him the confidence to stand up to a rude passenger instead of just suffering in silence for 5 hours. Reading his message made me feel like the Ralph situation had positive ripple effects beyond just my own experience. If my story helped other people develop the confidence to set boundaries with difficult people, then dealing with Ralph's nonsense had actually contributed something valuable to the world. Looking back on the whole experience now, I'm genuinely glad it happened even though it was miserable while I was going through it. The situation taught me important lessons about self-advocacy and creative problem-solving that I've used in other areas of my life. Ralph was absolutely terrible and made that flight way harder than it needed to be, but dealing with him made me stronger and more confident in handling difficult people. I learned that you don't have to accept mistreatment just because confrontation feels uncomfortable, and there are ways to stand up for yourself that don't require aggression or losing your temper. The experience showed me that strategic responses and staying calm under pressure are way more effective than getting emotional or just complaining to authority figures. I also learned the value of having witnesses and documentation, because other passengers seeing Ralph's behavior first made it impossible for him to successfully paint me as the problem. Most importantly, I learned that entitled people like Ralph count on others being too polite or conflict-averse to push back, and once you show them you're willing to match their energy, they often back down, or at least stop being quite so awful. I'm planning my next trip now and actually hoping for smooth, boring flights with considerate passengers who respect personal space and follow basic courtesy rules. I don't want another Ralph situation because dealing with him was exhausting and required way too much mental energy for a simple flight. But I'm also completely prepared if I encounter another entitled jerk who thinks the rules don't apply to them. The difference between now and before the Ralph incident is that I know exactly what to do, and I won't hesitate to stand up for myself. I've got my strategies ready, I understand how to document bad behavior, and I'm confident in my ability to mirror tactics back at problem passengers while staying within the rules. I've also learned to pack interesting snacks on every flight, not necessarily the extreme cheese arsenal I deployed against Ralph, but enough variety to have options if someone decides to test me. That preparedness gives me peace of mind when I travel, knowing I'm not helpless if someone tries to make my flight miserable. I can enjoy my trips without anxiety about potential conflicts because I've proven to myself that I can handle whatever comes up. The Ralph story has become my favorite example of how sometimes the universe delivers perfect karma, especially when you help it along with strategic pettiness and well-timed accidents. Life's too short to let entitled people make you miserable, and I'm glad I learned that lesson at 30,000 feet with an arsenal of smelly cheese and the perfect amount of turbulence. The whole experience reminded me that you don't have to be a doormat just because society tells us to be polite and avoid conflict. Sometimes the most satisfying response to bad behavior is giving people exactly what they're dishing out, just amplified enough that they finally understand how unpleasant they're being. Ralph never apologized or acknowledged his behavior was wrong, but he definitely understood by the end of that flight that targeting me was a huge mistake. Every time I tell this story at parties or give advice to friends dealing with difficult people, I remember that moment when Ralph's face turned green from my cheese selection and he realized he'd picked the wrong person to mess with. That memory makes me smile every single time.